Welcome to the Q Podcast.
Q is about conversation.
If we're really concerned about ending poverty, we've got to be more concerned about creating justice.
Our cultural products as Christians need to both defy and resonate with the culture.
And God's doing amazing things. His church is expanding, his church is growing.
It's not what's the purpose of my life, it's what is the purpose that's been assigned.
Stay curious, think well, advance good. This is Q.
Hi, welcome to another edition of the Q Podcast. I'm Gabe Lyons. Glad you're with us today. And as we head into Father's Day weekend, what an important conversation we're having today around orphans. The conversation and the talk and the interview that you're going to hear in just a moment is around something called the Orphan Myth. And it's a new perspective that Lindsay Hadley, the founder and CEO of Hadley Impact, as well as Elli Oswald, who you're going to hear more from today at the Faith to Action Initiative, are guiding us to think differently and think well about what is happening with the orphan crisis. Certainly when you hear those words, you instantly have a few images. You're thinking about how many orphans are there in America, children who are parentless, children who don't have a way to be connected to family. Well, when you hear this conversation, you're going to start to get a new perspective on how could we look at this a little differently? How could we just change seats for a second and see it from a different direction? How can we better understand the plight of the orphan and what that looks like not only in the U.S. but around the world, and what can we do about it? These two, along with several others, have created something called Orphan Myth. It is a 501c3 organization comprised of multiple NGOs, child advocacy specialists, influencers, faith leaders, businesses, and individuals dedicated to helping every child belong in a safe and loving family. And that's what you're going to hear in this conversation. How do we do that? How do we get there? We know the church has been strategic and has been focused on this issue now for many years. It's one of the reasons when the world looks at the church and says, what good is the church in my community? This is one of the ones that they point to. It's our concern for the orphan. It's our concern in the foster care movement. It's our concern to make sure every child has a family. So let's listen to this conversation and see how we can think well about orphans, adoption, and foster care. Thank you both for being here today. I just want to jump right in. Many people grew up in churches. Missionaries would come to our churches and tell us, we need your help. We need you to raise money to build an orphanage in our community. And yet the approach I think you guys are putting forward is maybe a little more innovative and different than that. Would you help us understand that?
Yeah, thank you, Gabe, so much for the chance to talk about this. Orphan Myth is a meta campaign that we created. Think the Got Milk commercial for the milk industry, but for 30 plus organizations who are addressing orphan care through family-based solutions. So we actually were brought to address this issue because there was this huge gap in awareness and understanding about the best solutions, the best outcomes. And so we did focus group testing, and we found that there were three major myths that we really needed to dispel. The first one is that orphans in orphanages around the world have no parents. Actually, in reality, as the video explained, 80% of the children living in institutional care have a living parent, many of which were placed there and relinquished because of poverty. The second myth that we're trying to address is that there are no orphans in the United States. That is just so not true. There are 420,000 children in foster care today, of which 100,000 will never go back to their families of origin and have been awarded custody of the states they live in. And they are our orphans. They ultimately need our care. They need to find permanent loving families. And the third and final myth is that there just is no solution. Unfortunately, supply and demand, there aren't enough parents that want these kids, and that's just not true. There are inspiring solutions. We've brought our friend Elli from Faith to Action to talk about some of that, Elli.
Yeah, I think for 12 years, Faith to Action has been talking to Christians in the U.S. about global orphan care, and the number one myth is that they think orphanages are necessary, they're needed. You know, children are alone or completely unsafe, and the reality around the world in the vast majority of countries is that's not true. Yeah. And I think what's helpful sometimes is to instead recognize that orphanages exist not because children are orphans, but they exist because families are poor and they're struggling to care for their kids. And we can understand more and have empathy more towards the parents who are making this impossible choice between caring for their child and putting them in a place where they couldn't do that, but they'd have access to 3 meals a day. They'd have access to education and a future. And that's an impossible choice. It's a terrible choice. And a parent should never have to make it.
Yeah, the 80% number, I mean, that's enormous. And I don't think a lot of us understand that many children actually have parents that still are living. What are some of the alternatives to traditional orphanages? What are some of the creative solutions you're finding to help these children?
Yeah. Well, the easy answer is families.
Yeah.
Families are the solution. Orphans don't need orphanages, orphans need families. And so, decades of research really has recognized the value of family for just the development of a child. And at the same time, we have been learning over and over that orphanages aren't having the impact that we wanted for kids. They're not having the outcomes we want. And there's one study that recognized that for every 3 months a child is in an orphanage, they lose 1 month of development. There's another more shocking study out of Russia that for adults who are raised in orphanages, 1 in 3 ended up homeless, 1 in 5 had some sort of criminal record, and really sadly, 1 in 10 had died from suicide. Adults who grew up in orphanages are telling us now, they're rising up and advocating for themselves. When I was there, I wanted family more than anything. And even as adults, I want family. And, it's intuitive. We all get this. If you're a parent, or maybe there's someone that you love, your nephew, what would you want? If you weren't able to care for that child, what would you want for that child?
Yeah.
It's grandma, it's auntie, eventually maybe a Christian loving home, but we never get to orphanage. We never do. And so we know our kids need families. All kids need families. And I think that's important.
What are some of the ways you've seen churches get involved and be helpful? We know so many of the churches that have been a part of the Q community have really been proactive on this front, thinking about this in the U.S. system. But how are you guys seeing it, and what is the opportunity that maybe is presenting itself right now?
Yeah, there's a growing movement of Christians that are involved and pursuing family care. But here's the reality, church. The church has a huge influence on care for kids around the world. We always have. From the early days of the church was bringing these children into their homes. But today, we're doing the same thing. There's going to be a study coming out from the Barna Group in a couple of weeks that estimates that U.S. Christians, you and I, individuals actually, not even foundations or major givers, are giving $3.3 billion a year to orphanages and children's home and other kind of group care. $3.3 billion every year. What if we transitioned that money to support kids and families? It's actually a perfect time for this change. It's an exciting time because what's going on in the world in 2019, right before COVID hit the United States, every country in the United Nations, which is all but 2 of the countries in the world, signed a commitment, a resolution that said, my country will prioritize family care and eliminate the use of institutional care in my country. It's a huge deal. And so in some ways, this train has left the station. It's chugging down the tracks. Change is happening. Reform is happening. My question is, where is the church going to be on this train, right? Yeah. Are we going to be the caboose that's kind of holding back and dragging along, maybe holding on to the old models of care? Or what I believe and what I hope for is that the church can actually be, the headlight of that train. Because we have a vision in Scripture of God's intention for family and creation. And we can be that, and that's my hope for the church.
Lindsay, you've seen a lot of strategies and innovations and approaches, globally on so many different issues. On this particular issues, what are you seeing that's starting to move the needle?
Well, that's why we started Orphan Myth. We realized that instead of having these organizations compete for attention, which often happens in the nonprofit sector, if we came together to espouse the same messaging and content at the same time, we could saturate the market and, like a rising tide, have all the boats come up. So just at the beginning of this last month, we launched the first public-facing campaign, and we were able to garner over 200 million media impressions. We had features in major publications such as Forbes and People magazine, CNN and Variety magazine. And we're able to get ambassadors and influencers to join the movement. People like Lyric Ross from the show This Is Us, Ben Higgins from The Bachelor, people like Nelson Mandela's grandson, Kwaku, and dozens more. We've also seen faith leaders rise up on this issue. People like Bob Goff and Francis Chan and Nick Vujicic lending their platforms to say, hey, We're learning together. Come on a supporter journey. Let's do better together. What we know is that every movement that's ever been made that our societies benefit from takes the individuals enrolling and coming on that supporter journey. So really, we need all of you, and you are truly the solution. So please get involved.
Well, the creative approach, and we've seen this happen with a few other movements where a convener like yourselves, Orphan Myth, comes along and helps these groups that are doing such great work, but they're not always lined up, and we don't always know what one another's doing, and it's less strategic. And it feels like where you're going with this is to try to create a way to just be more strategic. You know, time matters in this conversation. What are ways church leaders here, institutional leaders, people who are leading humanitarian organizations, what are ways they can be involved and connected with what you're doing?
Yeah, thank you for saying that. You're so right. Redundancy and duplication is waste. And we know this intuitively, that we're better together, we go further together. But oftentimes charities are competing and there's a scarcity mentality. So as a faith leader, check out things like the Faith to Action Network and the pledge you can sign. Come to orphanmyth.org, get involved, find out the 30 plus charities that are doing this great work, that are getting families every day into, children into families through prevention, reunification, or adoption. But ultimately, just realizing that some of our helping doesn't have the effects we really ultimately want, and we need to get more sophisticated. We can all do better together.
Well, and I think it's important to say the moves that have happened to this point have been good. I mean, creating an orphanage so that kids had somewhere to go in the moment of crisis has been helpful. Parents adopting children. I adopted a child from China that did not have a connection to a parent, and in the moment, that's the right thing. But as time goes forward, you're seeing nations wake up and go, wait, we want these children to stay here. We want them to have parents and families that are indigenous to our nation, to grow up in this culture. And so you are seeing these governments start to go, let's just see what we can do instead of sending all of our children off to keep them here. And so there is a thin line there of making sure that's done well, making sure they're cared for well. And so it's not that it's everything we've been doing is wrong, as much as I see it as, hey, we can just keep taking it to the next level of where we've never been before. And I think that's a beautiful opportunity.
We talk about when a family's in crisis or when a child's in crisis, they need options. And in so many of the communities, the option is the orphanage where they can get education or support. Yeah. But if we can support systems and services that allow it to be wraparound families, and the local church is the great place to do this. They're on the ground, engaging people, recognizing when they're in crisis and wrapping around them so that families can come through on the other side.
It's just about redirecting even a percentage of the $3 billion going out the door into long-term warehousing of children, and redirecting it into the ultimate solution we all know, which is that they need a family.
Yeah. That's good. Orphanmyth.org. Thank you guys for your faithfulness in this and for being with us. Thank them for their work. Well, I hope hearing from Lindsay and Elli was just so helpful as you try to understand this orphan crisis, but also the myth around orphans and how many of them do have families, many of them do have parents. How do we continue to connect children to parents? The Orphan Myth wants to dispel that widely accepted myth about the orphan and foster care system. They want to educate others about best practice solutions, and they're doing this really well at orphanmyth.org. If you go there, you can actually watch their video that helps you better see and understand the current narrative around orphans and how they're dispelling it and how they're trying to help. You can also see the multiple organizations that have come together to partner on this. I always love it when I see organizations like Orphan Myth that are bringing together the best thinking, the best practices, sharing information, not concerned with who gets the credit, but saying we need to solve this problem. We can do more together. And that's what you're going to see at orphanmyth.org. Well, this talk and many others are also available on the Q Media platform. You can have access to a free trial for 30 days through qideas.org/trial. And that'll not only give you access to this talk, but many of the other talks that took place at our most recent Culture Summit in late April. Those are releasing every week, more and more. And so we hope you'll enjoy that. And as you head into Father's Day, give thanks for your father. Give thanks for the family that God's put you in. Be somebody who, as you look even at your children, that you're committed to just how we're going to develop, disciple, help them grow into the types of men and women that are going to continue to contribute to the good in society and to flourishing because they're thinking well, they're staying curious, and they're advancing good.